Hello, everyone. It is so nice to see so many familiar and friendly faces in the audience. Welcome to our first NiCHE at 20 event, which is meant to reflect on the last 2 decades of NiCHE, because 2024 is our 20-year anniversary. And we are just really excited to have 5 of my dearest colleagues here to speak on a panel to reflect on some of the aspects of NiCHE and kind of representing different generations of NiCHE and different aspects of NiCHE. I myself have been the social media editor for a decade now, which is rather wild. And I also in 2014, 2015 was the NiCHE New Scholars rep. And that kind of catapulted me into being really involved with NiCHE, and it just has kind of snowballed from there. And I'm lucky enough to also be a co-editor-in-chief right now. So without further ado, I'm going to roll into our first speaker, who is going to be our founding director, Alan MacEachern. Alan, if you could just introduce yourself a little bit and then speak to how NiCHE was formed. What sort of activities did the network focus on and do well during the period of SSHRC funding that we had initially?
I think it's great, by the way. Thank you, Jessica. I teach history at Western University, and I just think it's so great that you're getting folks like us together before we die. I think it's so important. I've probably told this story a few times, and actually, for that reason, it's occurred to me that it might be better coming from someone who wasn't directly involved in NiCHE leadership, who suddenly heard about this network being formed and said, "What the heck is NiCHE?" quite reasonably. I guess I would just say that in the early 2000s, there was a wave of Canadian scholars who were identifying as Canadian environmental historians, I think, for the first time. And I helped organize a breakfast or two at the American Society for Environmental History for Canadianists, and there seemed to be some interest in getting some sort of Canadian organization going. And then in the summer of 2004, the SSHRC Social Science Humanities Research Council announced that they were creating this clusters program for the knowledge mobilization and dissemination. And it just seemed to some of us like it was going to be a really good way to help the Canadian environmental history community coalesce and to develop at the same time. So Stefan Castonguay, Colin Coates, Matthew Evanen, who I'm glad to see is on this call, keeping me honest here, Bill Turkel and myself, we basically came up with a catchy acronym, a logo, a website, and started willing the network into existence, I think you would say. And what would I say? I think it was a lot of work in the early years, kind of in developing the network, in getting it together. First of all, just to get the community behind the idea, to show that we could be trusted with their ideas and that we keep our promises. We were doing an awful lot, or it felt like we were, I think. Special issue of environmental history, textbooks, summer schools, workshops, regional networks, things like that. All while trying to convince SSHRC that we, in a very competitive field, that we were, that we could be an experiment and a demonstration of developing a decentralized scholarly network in a big country like Canada. And we took that responsibility, I think, as an experiment very seriously in the early years, or maybe still do, before we got the grant and then after. But it was all really predicated on getting Canadian environmental historians and historical geographers and others to get buy-in. And I think we really believed that they would only buy in if we were making their research and their teaching and their lives better. And so we worked hard at doing things that we thought could, we focused on methodology, we focused on collaboration, and I think an important part of NiCHE was encouraging interdisciplinary and international collaboration. We looked for public and open access outputs as much as possible, and a big part of it was to be a virtual network as much as possible. a line that we got from Shirk early on was that we were not just to fund Air Canada. And we really believed in that. I mean, to be sustainable in environmental terms and be sustainable in a post, in terms of a life beyond Shirk, we thought that the network would have to be, for the most part, engaging virtually. And it's been, thanks to some of the people here on this call over the last 20 years, that that's really happened. But our goal, I'm just going to end by saying our goal was really to, I always felt it was three parts. It was to create a Canadian scholarly group that was distinct from any other Canadian scholarly group. It was to create a Canadian environmental history that was distinct from other national environmental history organizations. And it was also basically just to be cool and to do something cool that we thought people would want to be a part of. And if we would succeed at those things, or maybe even two of those, or maybe even one of those, we'd be doing just fine. So that's me. That's what I'd say.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan. I declare that we are cool.
Okay.
I think we reached that. I think we got that goal going. So, um, so you're talking a lot about the influence of Shirk and the realities of dealing with the funding agency, right? And so Sean Kheraj, our second director, kind of came on in the era after Shirk funding. So Sean, could you speak to how NiCHE changed after the end of Shirk funding?
Sure. Thanks, Jessica. So just to follow up on some of Alan's remarks, we definitely were not paying Air Canada after the Shirk funding ended. So I'll highlight three things that I think changed around the mid 2010s, up to even up to now. So one was the funding, the money side of things changed. So we didn't have a steady grant to fund a lot of the travel, food, and kind of coordination of meetings. And so we ended up having to shift to more ad hoc sources of funding sort of after 2014 and onwards. So that's when we started seeking Shirk Connections grants funds for things like the Canadian History and Environment Summer School, but also funds from other groups. So our home institutions, depending on where the events were being held, research centers kicked in money to support those activities and have continued to do so up to today. The second major shift, I think, that occurred after 2014 was a shift to more emphasis on web publishing and online networking. So NiCHE had always been conceived of as a virtual network that could connect people across a big country. And we tried to do more of that work and leverage more of those opportunities because all of the investments that had been made in the digital infrastructure for NiCHE in its first decade were still available to us. So some of the big changes that occurred was the transition from Drupal to WordPress for anybody who cares about website platforms. But it was really significant for web publishing as we saw the blog take off as something that was drawing a lot of readers. And so we moved to a web publishing platform that made blogging much easier. This was also the time in which we started to place more emphasis on social media, both for disseminating stuff that we were publishing on the web, but also to build up our online network and to extend. And I think some of the people on this call are folks that we may have met via social media who then became more involved in NiCHE activities. We tried to elevate what we were publishing by introducing new forms of publication. So we started up Papers in Canadian History and Environment as our occasional peer-reviewed paper series, which we just published a recent one earlier this month. And we started supporting the publication of research project websites as subpages on the NiCHE website. So those were some of the new things that we did during this period after 2014. And then the last shift that I'll emphasize is a shift towards a greater dependency on voluntarism and some shifts in governance for NiCHE. So the NiCHE governance, when we had the large grant from Shirk, was sort of structured by the grant. So the way in which it was organized was dependent upon the terms of the grant. After that funding, things kind of opened up. It left us in a place where we had to kind of think about how we wanted to organize. Were we a scholarly association? Were we a scholarly association? Should we have like a constitution and membership and structure? So you saw evolution of like the executive committee, the development of subcommittees, the breakout of an editorial group. And then eventually in, I should get the year right. I think it was 2020, it might have been 2021. We registered as a not-for-profit corporation, which has then enabled the fundraising that we've been able to do for the last 3 years. And that speaks back to the first shift of the no money. Now we are at a some money stage, which is enabling different kinds of things as NiCHE moves forward. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, that's an outline of a lot of important changes that have happened. And I came in on the very end of the SSHRC funding days and have been mainly here when we have zero money. And now we have, as you noted, a little bit of money. And I think, yeah, that's the next evolution in NiCHE, is figuring out that part. But we can talk about that more later. As we've noted a little bit, NiCHE has been really instrumental in a number of generations of scholars now. And Jennifer Bonnell came in, I believe, was one of the early NiCHE New Scholars reps, and then was a part of our executive and still stays on with a few initiatives. So Jennifer, if you could speak to what influence NiCHE has had on generations of graduate students who came up during the emergence of the network.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jess. It's fun to be here. And this whole event has, had me thinking about those early years. I started my PhD in 2004, the same year that NiCHE began. So I guess I was a good choice for this comment. I started my PhD with Ruth Sandwell. And at that point, I had never even heard of environmental history as a thing. And I was actually new to history as a discipline. So Ruth just sort of put this idea in my ear, and all of us, it just sounded so good. It sounded like what I'd been looking for a really long time. And so I ended up shifting my project quite significantly, the early work on the history of the Don River in Toronto, to be thinking about that from more of an environmental history scholarship lens. And in terms of NiCHE, I just felt scooped up by this developing network. I wasn't in a history department. I was in an education department at the University of Toronto, at OASI. And so I was really seeking a community of historians, and NiCHE and its graduate students and its faculty really became my people as I started to develop this project and, moved my way through the PhD process. I think the support in the first place for new projects in this field in Canada was just astonishing as someone who was starting a PhD, just to think that there was a group of scholars who were interested in seeing these projects develop, first of all. But then the actual financial support for collaborative projects that came out of those early years of the grant. And I'll give an example of the companion project to my research, which was the Don Valley Historical Mapping Project that the network supported, with a helpful seed grant that set off my collaboration with Marcel Fortin, the map and data librarian at the time at U of T. And many of these projects became books. So, the Don Valley Historical Mapping Project, as sort of a side initiative, not only informed my research on the Reclaiming the Don book, but it also ended up becoming the origins of a book on historical GIS research in Canada, which is part of the Canadian History and Environment series. Thank you, Sean, at the University of Calgary Press. And, so just the support to, and the encouragement, I think the encouragement is something really important in addition to the financial support. Yes, you can do this. No, you're not too green. We'll help you. And I think that's all sort of nurtured through the community that NiCHE forged in those early years through events like chess, which would bring senior scholars together with new and emerging environmental historians and graduate students, and still does, thank goodness, to our, well, I understand the current Connections grant for this year's chess wasn't successful, but we've had a really good run with Canadian federal funding for chess and really creative financing of these summer school events, which I think in my mind are such a core part of NiCHE activities in bringing people together and fostering that face-to-face community building, and allowing young scholars like I was in the early 2000s to meet some of the more established scholars in the field. And those bus journeys, sitting on a bus next to Graham Wynne as a young scholar, and benefiting from those conversations and what would become, I think, career-long people in your network. That stuff is just really hard to put a value on. I think the regional networks that NiCHE supported in the early years included encouragement and some support for the development of a Toronto environmental history group, supporting some of our early dinners. And again, that fostered a local community. I think one of the things I'll close on is that the community that NiCHE developed in those early years, and the cohort of graduate students that it sort of lifted up and supported through the projects that I've mentioned, the regional networks, participation in national conferences. So the fact that NiCHE helped to create a subgroup at the CHA and really put environmental history on the map. And the post-2014 work has really expanded on that as well. I think the evidence is that many of us in that early cohort found positions in environmental history, and now have the privilege of holding environmental history positions in universities, not only across Canada but beyond. So I'll stop there with thanks to Alan, and thanks to that to Matthew, who's also here as one of the early executive members, in recognizing that it wasn't just about, funding air travel and funding the pet projects of an executive team. It was about building a community and building a field, I think, in Canada. And NiCHE can really be credited with that.
Thank you, Jen. That was lovely. I love that descriptor of being scooped up, because I kind of feel similarly. And as I guess I would kind of be the generation after the first generation, so second G NiCHE. But as I've moved along in my career, like, one of my main goals has always been to continue that pattern of really supporting new scholars and bringing them in and giving them a place where they feel comfortable and that they belong. And I think NiCHE is, in my opinion, with how I've interacted with other academic orgs, is pretty unique in that way. And one of the people that I met very early on was our next panelist, Andrew Watson, when we were both PhD students back in 2013. And since then, we have been able to foster a friendship and long professional career as well. And so as we turn to Andrew Watson, I wonder, Andrew, if you could talk about some of the most significant contributions NiCHE has had to the field of environmental history in Canada. It's a pretty big question, but 5 minutes.
Well, a lot of them have been mentioned already. It's hard to talk about any facet of NiCHE's history over the last couple of decades without touching on how significant it's been. I was remarking just before we started the recording that it's, when I started my PhD in 2007, I think I would have found it very hard to believe that I would end up on a panel with you folks talking about NiCHE at 20 years. It was sort of inconceivable, because at the time, NiCHE really did represent this landmark moment in what it meant to be an aspiring historian, to just sort of build on some of the things that Jen mentioned. But I think in the interim time between when I started and now, I think it's become easier and easier to sort of take niche for granted in some ways, because it is so well established, because has so many people involved over the years. It's done so much for so many people's careers as scholars and writers, that it's easy to sort of misplace the role that it's had in developing the network in Canadian history and environment. It seems so obvious to say it that way, but we take it for granted. So at the same time, I think it is perhaps it's not easy to overstate how much importance niche has had over the years. In some sense, I know we sort of been dancing around saying this outright, but I don't think there really was Canadian environmental history before niche. There were Canadian historians and historical geographers who went to ASCH and kind of like two toddlers at a swimming pool kind of circle one another until they figure out, okay, I see you do what I do. Okay, so let's talk. But niche, I think, finally made Canadian environmental history. And since then, it's undisputed that niche is where you go as a hub to talk about environmental historian history, to find other environmental historians. And it's only been able to do that because of how inclusive it's been over the year. It has consistently defined who gets to be part of the club by having a huge umbrella. And I think that's a really important contribution to make in the early years of developing a field. But even since then, it's constantly been about bringing people in from fields, disciplines that aren't necessarily historically minded specifically, but even adjacent fields like sociology, anthropology, geography. I mean, we've consistently made an effort to bring people into niche because interdisciplinarity is central to environmental history. And so one of the main contributions I would say that niche has made over the years is the effort to create a really big umbrella. And that umbrella doesn't just end at the borders of Canada, right? It's bringing people who aren't even necessarily doing Canadian environmental history into our groups as well, to learn about Canadian environmental history, to understand how extensive our group of scholars doing this kind of work has become over the years, and to make sure that Canadian environmental history doesn't become sort of siloed as a national project, but it's always thinking about and connecting with work outside. And I think because niche has made such a big umbrella, I might venture to say that Canadian environmental scholarship is amongst the best in the world at connecting our work in Canadian places and Canadian histories with things that are happening in other parts of the world, because we are so mindful of how our network is connected with scholars in many other places. So it's already been mentioned a couple of times, but I would say that community and identity is the key contribution that niche has made. That it would have been very hard, I think, without niche for there to be a coalescence of people who self-identified as environmental historians without it being some sort of branch of the ASCH or a group of people who saw one another at the CHA doing similar kinds of work. But it has created, without necessarily ever having to rely on membership dues, it's created a sense of membership and belonging and identity that's generally is only reserved for large associations that charge membership dues and give people a sense of belonging in those ways. But there are a variety of sort of more concrete outputs, you might say, that are significant contributions from niche, right? So in behind Alan on the shelf there is every single monograph that has been published, every collection and edited collection and monograph that's been published with the niche series, the University of Calgary niche series that Alan edits. Sean mentioned the papers in Canadian history and environment piece that both Sean and Jen Bonnell edit. There is, of course, the website, which started off as a way of trying to generate content to sort of create a holding place for niche as we figured out what the world would be like without all the shirk money. And over time, thanks in large measure to Jessica DeWitt, the website is now ballooned into a place where we have more than 200,000 site visits a year. So it's become a place with an enormous audience for environmental history globally. So those are some tangible ones, but there's also a variety of other ones. There's the NiCHE prize for best book or best in 1 year, and then in alternating years, best chapter or article published in Canadian environmental history in any particular year. There are the Nature's Past podcast that Sean has been publishing for many years. I think we're you're into like the 40s, I think, if not more of them now. And recently, Jessica has quickly eclipsed the total number of podcasts in her NiCHE Conversations series, where she talks with authors about the work that they published on the NiCHE site. I'm wearing the current iteration of what has been a long time dream for some executive members at NiCHE to have some paraphernalia that's NiCHE branded. This is one of the sweatshirts that we sold last year as part of our fundraising activities. But again, these are all indications of what effectively is an ongoing community that continues to go from one generation to the next, right? We're coming up pretty quickly on what could potentially become now the fourth generation of environmental historians to start popping out of the network in Canadian history and environment.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a solid overview. And yeah, we've accomplished a lot. I'm very proud of us as a group. I think we're pretty great. I'll go back to the word cool. So as you noted, our last panelist is kind of the latest generation of NiCHE, and is someone who I first became aware of and then built a friendship with online, and who then joined our new editorial team, which we're on the third year of that. So in the past, the NiCHE executive was the editorial team as well. And then about 3 years ago, we expanded to having a team of 10 editors in addition to the executive. And Estraven Lupino-Smith is one of those. And so, Estraven, I wonder if you could, from your perspective, speak to the ways that NiCHE has broadened in scope in recent years.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Well, I think it's so helpful to be like chronologically last to join as far as the crew that's here, and also last on the panel. So I really get a sense of some of the things that happened before I was involved. But I think even as you're mentioning, just that we met, we've never met in person, that and really, I think, met through the kind of work that I was doing actually as an artist, and an artist with like a research practice. And then to be accepted, invited into the editorial board as somebody who wasn't formally an academic at the time. I'm now pursuing a PhD in geography at UBC at the University of British Columbia. But I'm also not really a historical geographer, more a political ecologist. So I'm definitely talking about environment, but formally, I would say the kind of writing that I do isn't officially history. And I think that's part of what's, at least what I've seen happen with NiCHE in the past couple of years, is really broadening even on the H, like maybe it's moving into more of humanities and a more broad scope of what history and the humanities are doing in general, which I think is so important for a lot of people to see that that there's other ways to do more, like to move not necessarily away, but to add on to the conventional ways of doing this kind of work in history. And certainly we saw that with both the series that we worked on together, Jess, Succession, which had a lot of different kinds of submissions, not just paper style blog posts, and also seeing the NiCHE New Scholars this year doing the academic arts work, which has been really, really inspiring and also just super interesting to see because, because I started as more of an arts worker and somebody who's doing community work for a long time before returning to the academy. And I think that that's another piece of what I've seen with NiCHE, which is really exciting, is what I feel like is now like a buzzy word around public scholarship, but actually, especially from what I'm hearing in the last 20 years, that's kind of been this key part of what NiCHE is doing. So not only building this network, but also, especially obviously through the blog, creating these spaces for other people, not just academics, to access what people are doing in Canadian history, the historians themselves, the work that's happening. And I know that I've talked to a couple people at least over the last couple of years who've asked me like, oh, do you know about NiCHE? Like, you should get involved in that. Well, actually, I'm already kind of, involved there, do this and that. And that's people outside of Canada who see the work that's going on with the blog and are really, I think, look to it as a really inspiring model for what you can do with web publishing and public scholarship and expanding the ways that the information that we gather, the things that we do as researchers can be disseminated and can be shared beyond just our own circles. So I think that's a really important part of it as well. And I think that there's something really exciting to see the ways that the work that NiCHE has done paralleling the way that environmental humanities has this like new and exciting and sort of, at least for me as a new scholar, potential to pair a lot of the work that some of us, like I said, who've been doing the community work end of things where we're doing different kinds of environmental projects. So I worked as an artist who did a lot of environmental residencies, working with community groups, working with universities, kind of bridging these community, academic, trying to bring everything together, never really fitting anywhere, which is why I like the humanities, because it's like, a way to sort of not really fit, but find a place to fit. Geography also offers that to some of us. And to see that reflected in the work. And because so much I feel like, especially of the younger, even the undergrads that I'm now working with are, want to ask a lot about what the relevance of research is. They really need to know what the relevance of it is. Like what, is it accessible enough? Is it relevant enough? And I think that NiCHE really delivers on that for folks to see that there is something to do with scholarship besides just hang out with other nerds that you get to, flex your brain with, which is, I think, what a lot of us got involved in doing any kind of research is, because that's what we like to do. It's fulfilling for us. But as you folks are all mentioning, it's extra fulfilling when you're connecting with other people and then who are also into that work. But then to see that expand beyond just our circles, I think has been, really neat to watch and makes us cooler than other academic things that are happening, other projects, right? So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Estraven. That was great. And it has been a privilege to get to know you and to work with you over the last several years. At this point, I want to note to our audience that questions and comments are welcome from everyone at this point. You can either put them in the chat or raise your hand on Zoom. And please do jump in because there's people here who have a lot of experience with NiCHE and I'd love to hear from you. But to start the second portion of this off, we've talked a lot about NiCHE's strengths today. So why don't we talk a bit about the weaknesses of NiCHE? What are our weaknesses? Anyone want to speak?
I can jump in first, with the obvious that there are none. But if we have to choose some weaknesses, there are continued challenges with sort of building up a cycle of volunteers to run the organization. So that's a challenge I think that we've faced for several years. We have lots of great colleagues who are now involved in a whole bunch of different ways, but we need to be able to move people in and out of the organization. We've done a little bit of that in terms of having a 3-year cycle for executive members so that they can rotate off of the executive, but recruiting more colleagues to get involved continues to be a challenge, I would say. That's one point.
Yes, to build off of that, NiCHE, we have discussed recently, has been almost too good at bringing in new and precarious scholars, and to the point that we are having a really hard time bringing tenured folk in to lead. So I think too much of our work right now, our volunteer work, is falling on the shoulders of grad students, precariously employed students, etc., precariously employed scholars, etc. So that, I think, is a bit of a weakness, and one that we haven't completely figured out yet, but we're getting there. Anyone else want to build on any, want to drag us?
I will just add that I think it's an odd consequence of having become so enormously successful, I would say, is that kind of going back to the point I started off with before, is saying it's sort of easy to take niche for granted, is that it appears as though niche just hums along very well, right? It looks like everything's going fine. And so if everything's going fine, which for the most part, everything at niche is going very fine. It's like, it's an enormous amount of work, and it's not all evenly distributed amongst people on the executive or the editorial board, but that's never going to be the case. But it runs so well that the perception then is, oh, it looks like it's going great, then I'll leave it to the people who are doing such a great job with it. And so thinking about how, I think one of the weaknesses right now is the ways in which we at NiCHE could communicate how and where people are needed, how and where they might contribute, how and where they might do something that is new, something they can think up, and something, not just something, what do we need, but to communicate the ways in which we could imagine NiCHE changing in some ways, and making it clear that there is a lot of openness for people who aren't involved right now to getting involved in some specific ways, but also the openness to hearing the ideas that people might have for what NiCHE could be in 5 years or 10 years, that kind of thing. So I think rather than just making it appear as if everything's humming along great, I think NiCHE, we could all work harder at NiCHE to make it clear that there is the desire to find out what NiCHE could be in 5 or 10 years too.
Jen?
I would just throw into I don't think this is a weakness, it's just a question for the future, is as we've broadened the tent, and with that, the kinds of things that Estraven was mentioning, NiCHE has really changed, right? Especially in the last 5 years. And I think this is great in that we've continued to widen the number of people who are involved in the network. But I think it does bring about something of some identity questions. As the blog has continued to become more of a humanities-oriented blog, where does this leave the journal, Papers in Canadian History and Environment, which still is taking on that older, or at least original, more environmental history focus? And so I think as the executive and as the network continues to grow, we have some questions that we need to ask about what we want these various publication venues and outlets within NiCHE to reflect, as our membership changes. So that's just something that occurs to me as well.
Anyone else?
Maybe I'll add one more, and this will be a setup for Alan. In reflecting on the changes that occurred with NiCHE post 2014, as I was writing my notes out, it occurred to me for 3 years during that period of time, we were limited almost exclusively to online interactions. We didn't have summer schools for 3 years. We didn't have ASEHs or full ASEHs to attend, or Canadian Historical Association meetings, which are kind of the two conferences that most NiCHE members end up meeting up with one another. And so we went through a stretch in which our virtual network was very important during the pandemic and sustained the connections among people. But having emerged out of that, what we might do to think about rebuilding the collaborative functions of NiCHE that brought people together is something I'd like us to be thinking about going forward. But Alan has written about this on the website as well, so I wondered if he wanted to say anything.
I think I left it all on the page, which I try to do, so I don't have to talk in moments like this, Sean. In fact, maybe I'll find the URL for that for anyone who's interested. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure if this is really an answer, but I think one of the things I did after stepping down as director is I really wanted to step back because I wanted other people not just to take the lead, but know that they're getting the responsibility and the credit for taking the lead of NiCHE. And I think a lot of us, and I should not speak for Matthew or anyone else who was involved in those early years, but I think a lot of us step back, and I think we would like, I think there's be opportunities to step back forward a little bit. And I think that maybe one of the things NiCHE could be doing now is more proactively going after those tenured folks and giving them a shake and asking them to be more involved. I think right now we have kind of I don't really fully understand the role of a member of NiCHE. Like I understand the executive, and I think you've made a great job in terms of showing what the executive functions are. But I think you could make clearer the role of the member in the network. It was kind of a wide-ranging response. That's what I had at the moment.
I think that's true, Alan, and that's something that we talk about on the NiCHE Exec Lock is who are our members? And there was a time when we considered anyone who had registered for an account on the website to be a member. But the website, that was when we were very insular, and it was the same, 20 people writing for us all the time. And, now we have, well, closing in on 2,000 people. So I don't think that's I think we need to figure that out. And I also, when we lost our funding and the pandemic paired together, the focus on the website became, the website was kind of free, so we could really focus on that. And and the website is going well, but yeah, I would really love for us to be able to build out from the website again, to reach out again and become more than the website. And that is going to require more people being involved. It simply is. And particularly people who have access to money. So I'm going to go to Sarah, and then there's a question from Blake, and then we'll see where we are there.
I was actually going to answer Blake's question, and then that sort of actually follows up with what Alan was saying earlier. So I'm going to read Blake's question. Blake, I hope that's okay. You said you're hiding at work, so presumably you're not going to come on screen. So Blake, who's our most recent New Scholars lead, who's just been finished that position. So he says, thanks for the discussion. I think that NiCHE offers a great space for those of us outside of academia to stay connected with what's going on in the field, and our colleagues in academia totally, absolutely agree. As to the question related to Sean and Jessica's earlier comments about the difficulties of attracting new volunteers, do folks see potential difficulties or opportunities ahead for NiCHE, given the changing landscape of more scholars in precarious positions, more engagement from members outside the academy? So this is something that we have been talking about constantly in terms of the conversations we're having within the executive. And it's particularly highlighted by the fact that I'm currently the chair of NiCHE, which I have no business to be. So what we're seeing is the exact same pattern that's happening in the academy, which is that tenured faculty are retiring and leaving positions, and that those positions are then being filled by precarious scholars. So in the same way that I am a precarious scholar working as a sessional professor in my department, filling positions that would have previously been tenure positions, we're seeing the same thing at NiCHE. So the permanent faculty are leaving in very good hands, and it's wonderful that we have this opportunity as non-tenured faculty to be participating in an organization like this. We're also not getting an influx of new tenured faculty into the exec. So we have, and to speak to what Alan said about how we should be sort of shaking those trees, we are actually actively doing that. So our most recent executive position, we specifically decided to approach tenured faculty. So Shannon is here. Shannon has come on as a new exec member, very excited about that, and that's been a priority. So as exec members turnover, that's going to be a priority for the next little while, is specifically bringing in tenured faculty to the executive. And yeah, we've been too successful at being open and inclusive, and it's meant a really wonderful ability for many of us to stay connected and stay rooted in this community in a way that often doesn't happen when you sort of graduate and then you're just sort of thrown out to the wild. But we do need to make sure that there's a mix of senior and junior scholars in the executive going forward. So happy to answer any questions about that as well. Either maybe not here, but if anyone wants to follow up on that, happy to chat.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I just want to reiterate that we have no problem finding volunteers to edit and write for us. The problem is at the executive. We have more than enough people who want to be a part of NiCHE in that capacity, but when it comes to like core leadership, we need help, and we need people to come on and be serious about it. Yeah. Anyone have anything to add about that?
Yeah, it's been sort of interesting to take a step back here and think about these generations. I think I was commenting while I was muted. We have the shortest generations ever. I started in 2004 and I started in 2007. We are different people. But I think you're right, Sarah. I think, some of the challenges about leadership at NiCHE and turnover is related to changes in academia and hiring in academia. So I know Jen and I have talked about the challenges that we face in the period of which we are in our careers, where we have more and Claire has talked about this. She's one of the co-editors of PICHE as well, that we're all now in different kinds of academic leadership roles, and they take us away from what we're able to do in terms of service with NiCHE. And Matthew as well has taken on significant academic leadership role in his position at UBC. And there, I remember having early conversations with colleagues who first got hired as assistant professors who were reluctant to take on the kind of professional service work with NiCHE because they were starting new in a tenure track position, not realizing that that's actually the best time to be doing this kind of work. In mid-career, once you're tenured as an associate professor, that is when you'll have the least time to do this because you'll need to be a department chair, or you'll need to be a program director to, deal with your day job. And so it's actually that period in the probationary period that's the best opportunity. And certainly for myself, like I think I ended up doing the most of my work with NiCHE around volunteerism during that period as an assistant professor and a little bit post tenure. And then it becomes more challenging afterward. And then I expect maybe in a few years, I'll have more time to come back to it, to Alan's point of the like step back, but then step forward. And I think that's maybe the cycle that we need to be thinking about.
Matthew?
Yeah, thank you so much for all the really thoughtful reflections on the career of NiCHE over time. It's been really interesting for me as someone who has stepped back to hear about all that's been going on recently. It does strike me on reflection that some of these problems of bringing people in and getting additional help and so on reflect some of the problems of the early days too, because in a sense, and Alan contradict me, but I think there was a hope initially that there would be broad-based support from colleagues in faculty positions when we started. And to our amazement, maybe, or it just revealed how naive we were, there wasn't a huge response like that. The real energy and ideas and capacity came from grad students who saw NiCHE as a vehicle for building networks and finding opportunity and sharing their work. And so I think NiCHE evolved because of who wanted to become involved. And so there's always a balance, I think, in how it operates between what we might think of as service or our aspirations and community interests to build a field and to engage with others and so on. And then the hard realities of self-interest that everybody is faced with, whether in precarious positions or in faculty positions. And certainly I don't know that I could have become involved in the way I did without the grant opportunity aspect to NiCHE in the early days, because that was something that was recognized and appreciated in my department. So maybe in that outreach currently, there needs to be some thought as to the different kinds of self-interest that will drive participation too. And I don't have an answer particularly, but it's good to be realistic about that.
Yeah, Matthew, I really agree with that. There's lots of opportunity too. One of the biggest things we worked on from like 2012 to 2015 was like niche sustainability. How could we use as much of the infrastructure from the original grant to kind of set up a long-term sustainability plan for niche? And then a few years ago, we had to do sort of digital sustainability, which was like a server migration to get it into a state that we could self-manage the website and preserve, the material and continue to publish and all of that. So a lot of work's been done to kind of lay the groundwork. NiCHE is in a really sustainable state in terms of like the infrastructure of what we do. So now there's opportunities for people to build on top of that, and I think it's a good time for some I don't know, like a NiCHE retreat, new reflection, like what is the current mission of NiCHE? What should it be? Does it need to be changed? And where are there new opportunities? And we've talked variously about like, what's the next big grant? Could we try for something big? It's been many years since we've tried. So that could be an opportunity.
Thank you, Sean and Matthew, on those reflections. Let's see. Well, I'll throw out Justin's question since I haven't read Caroline's comment. So Justin has a very big question, and that he just wants to know what you think we'll be reflecting on when we host NiCHE at 30.
Wow, it was such a big deal that we got those millions of dollars again. And that we're flush once again, and we don't have to worry about money for 5 to 10 years. Wow, amazing.
Our AI robot overlords are treating us so well and writing so much great content for us.
That's how we won the grant, because with AI.
I will be excited about how common it is for people to set up their research projects as subpages on the NiCHE website, and that will become the standard for new research in environmental history in Canada.
Which you all can do right now. Get in touch. Alan, did you have your hand up?
I was just thinking how I would really like, as much as I love the blog and read the blog religiously, I would like more members of the community to be thinking about NiCHE in terms of publishing permanence rather than kind of the ephemerality that we rely on so heavily now. And I mean, who knows what permanence looks like in publishing world right now or in the world right now. But I think I would like to see more. I'd like to see in 2034 that we're seeing more evidence of larger collaborative outputs having been generated in the past 10 years.
Awesome. Okay, any other comments on that? We have a question from Caroline. We're almost at time, but we'll sneak this in. Caroline, who is a member of our editorial team, who is someone I met digitally on Instagram, and then is now a core member of our editorial team, has designed our 20-year logo refresh. And we're going to have new merch out soon, as well as a new logo. So thank you, Caroline, for that. And she asks, are there ways we can use the resources of the editorial team to forge allyship during this time? With like very tenured folks, for instance, with people who are more precarious. So what kinds of things can we do? Supports can we offer to make our platform approachable to them and to precarious and seasonally serving faculty? I guess kind of just building off to how are we handling the precarity of our institutions and our professions?
I think it's a tricky situation, right? Because right now one of our ambitions is to be able to offer honoraria for precariously employed folks. But that does also leave us open to the encouraging sort of precariously employed folks to becoming more and more of our authorship, right? Because it's clear that we have money to pay out precariously employed authors, and then there's a sort of an attraction to come and publish with NiCHE. And then what is the right sort of ratio of sort of people with secure employment versus precarious employment? What's the ratio of those two groups as authors in our sort of publishing lineup? Because on the one hand, it's great that we offer honoraria, but on the other hand, it sort of creates an incentive for more and more of our publishing to be precariously employed, and so ends up putting a lot more of the weight of our publications, of website publications. So I think this might be a controversial thing to say, but I think we should, just like I think a lot of universities should be very mindful of what the ratio of their teaching is being done by precariously employed people. I think NiCHE should be careful about how much of our publishing is done, how much of our writing is being done by precariously employed people. Not to, remove the opportunities for people to publish, but to make sure that we don't inadvertently, even through good intentions, create a situation where we become a gig economy, in a sense, for creating content for the website. And I think that might be an actual allyship thing, is to be mindful of how much we rely on precarious authorship.
One thing I've been thinking about is like ways in which contract lecturers can get support through NiCHE for their work, right? So we have a teaching resources section of the website. We've always had a teaching resources section of the website, and it is always quite a neglected section of the website, and we refresh it every once in a while. And we've tried to do like a syllabus repository at one point. So I wonder if there's an opportunity to think about like things that NiCHE can do around professional development in teaching to support, and that could be something that could help colleagues who are teaching as sessional instructors or contract lecturers to have a little environmental history community that they can connect with, where we could maybe do sessions together about teaching environmental history, which we've done a bunch of versions in the past. And then my dream for the future, when I have time in my life, is to do an open access textbook in environmental history. And that, again, could be a resource that could be made available to everybody for free, and to be able to use for your teaching, and maybe take the load off course prep when you're given a environmental history course to teach 2 weeks before it starts. And that's not impossible to do. We did a Canadian history one. We can do an environmental history one.
Yes.
In the meantime, the Method and Meaning book is available, and that is open access.
Yeah. And it's still used quite a bit from our stats. So, yeah, I think I no matter how supportive and community driven we are, we're still linked to the academic system, and academic writing and writing in general is exploitative. And it's really hard to balance that. It's just a reality. and that those of us, not myself, but those of you who have tenure track or tenure positions have, that cushion behind you to deal with that exploitation, to be writing for free, right? So, yeah, I think it's a really big question that isn't just niche, but it's important to think about. Yeah, so we're at noon, so I think I'm gonna wrap it up and thank everyone. I just want to say that this is just our first event. Next week, I am going to release a Niche at 20 call, and this is a call that is going to invite folks to propose events, whether they're online or in person, as well as blog posts, etc., that are going to reflect on the 20th year and celebrate the 20th year for the rest of 2024. So that's going to be open for everyone. One thing that I'm trying to plan is a Niche New Scholars reunion, New Scholars Rep reunion, kind of like, well, where are they now? Get together of Niche New Scholars Reps. A number of us are here today. Yeah, so I just want to say, keep an eye out for that. And please do, if you want to get together, have a get together in Ottawa of, 10 niche people, past and present. That's cool. It's like, get it happening. And I think we were going to be planning to do some kind of meeting at CHA.
I was just going to say that. Yeah, so we'll have a meeting at CHA.
Yeah, and do some. I think we have a lot to think about as we move forward in the nonprofit era of niche. Like, I think this is some of us have really talked about how this is definitely a turning point. Like, we have to get going on what niche is going to be in the next 10 years. So, okay.
Niche
Thanks,
pays
everyone.
taxes now. That's the big change. We pay taxes.
We pay taxes.
We pay an accountant to do our taxes.
Excellent. Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to end the recording now and